short 10 minutes, I would like to go into what is the science of learning in education. I think we all know what is science of learning, but I would like to define what science of learning in education means. We all know, perhaps you have heard before, there is a famous saying called, "The map is not the territory." Or Michael Polanyi says, we know a lot more than we can tell. There is some form of implicit knowledge, personal knowledge that human beings have. When we go through lived experiences, we know more, much more than what we can even verbalize. So this forms the premise that the map, that means the representations that we verify our knowledge, is not the territory being the lived experiences that we go through. So on this premise, there has been a movement in schools on the Maker movement, for example, where the original Cartesian dualism, the distinction between mind and body, being distinguishable and not well connected as a whole, as an embodied whole, has been questioned by embodied theories of learning. So we find that when we go through lived experiences of learning, and then from the lived experiences, we verbalize or verify what we do, it is a pedagogy that's very consistent to experiential learning. And I think in the last decade, we have observed that many more low progress students appear to require such a pedagogy a lot more than the very abstracted forms of knowledge where we kind of like have the students sit through lessons in a very stoic fashion. But that experiential forms of learning, though it might not appear as efficient as it would otherwise have come true in our typical ways in which we do classroom learning, presupposes the notion that learning is embodied. So this again is consistent to recent MOE initiatives such as in applied learning and in ways in which design and thinking is a key curricular tenet or pillar for our schools. So we know that there's probably about a 50-50 ratio between individual and environment. And it's important that we try to figure out how the individual co-interacts with the environment in order to create that synergy with the environment for which learning occurs. So learning sciences as a theory begins to go into the intersection between the individual and the environment to look at the interface or the interaction. And if we can design this interactional process well, then the embodiment of learning occurs. Now, if we were to look at embodied view, we will realize that we can unpack this entire learning notion into cognition, emotions, and beliefs, as you can see on the end of this table. And then you will find that the science of learning as we know it today delves into cognitive processes and the neural underpinnings of, say, cognition and how it occurs in the individual brain. And then the learning sciences looks at the interactional mechanisms between the individual and the environment. And then you will find that sociological research delves into the social mechanisms that enable the conditions of the environment or the social cultural factors helping learners embed themselves in these cultural factors for which learning can occur. And across this, you can see from the early childhood to adult development, a lifespan in which we can observe, and that cognition, emotions, and beliefs span across the learning experience. So in a nutshell, this diagram shows the three fields of study: science of learning, learning sciences, and social policy, or the science of systems, if you would see it, how schools can become an environment scaled up with the kinds of informed understandings from the science of learning and the learning sciences to enable learning to occur, whether it is in embodied forms or in more abstracted forms of learning, or both as a mechanism for learning. So we find that there are therefore, three layers of learning we can figure out. First, at the very microgenetics of human learning, and that's where neuroscience comes in to unpack, say, for example, why, even for low progress students, the use of gestorial forms helps them to engage in meaning making. And we know our former colleague, Jennifer Yeo, who studied academically more challenged students and how they use gestorial forms in significations and representational forms for the way they construct scientific meaning making. And then if you advance from the micro to the meso level, we can see the learning sciences in the design components of how the social cultural context interfaces with the individual factors. And then at the macro level, over time, you can see the cultural, historical, contextual orientations for how learning would occur, and therefore how policy would be able to be situated to enable the windows of opportunity across the lifespan for that learning to be optimized for the student. So in a nutshell, this diagram was actually done about 3-4 years back. And at that time, there was little talk about the science of learning. But in our studies, we could recognize and see that even in productive failure, the very famous study that we have originally conducted by Manu Kapu, that if students were to engage in explorations before direct instruction is given to the students are able to develop intuitive resources to enable them to have far transfer in the problem-solving word problems given to them. So how do intuitive resources, or Michael Poyani's notion of personal knowledge, build up in our students or in our lived experiences? We really don't know. And so perhaps we can find a neurological basis for how far transfer occurs through lived experiences or through experiential learning. And this would then benefit our students who require such experiential, embodied, gestorial forms of learning. And these forms the intuitive knowledge that occurs in the individual or in the brain before it is manifested in behavioral, observable, ethnographic approaches. So within this diagram, you can see that many years ago, we already observed that in classrooms, these implicit dimensions of knowing occurs. And from these implicit dimensions, hopefully we can have a window into the brain. We can then figure out the scaffolding, mediating mechanisms, whether the mechanisms are cognitive, behavioral, or even character values in orientation through the pedagogy of role performance or role play, whether it's an avataric role play or it's a role playing in life form, whether these pedagogical enactments create learning opportunities and learning mechanisms that formerly we regarded as unimportant. But I think with the science of learning techniques, we should be able to have a window into these pedagogies, such as play and role performances, and hypothesize that perhaps there is a need, particularly for certain orientations of students in terms of their learning, to require such pedagogies. And without these pedagogies, we could disadvantage them in their learning endeavors. And so SOLE, in a nutshell, we want to aim towards learning for all students of all orientations and kinds. And we want to perhaps complement the T1, T2 studies to start from T4 and T3, moving backwards, informing the neuroscience of problems of practice that's already occurred in our school system, as mentioned earlier. And these could be the biological, physiological aspects of learning in complement to the cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural dimensions. And then we can leverage not just on the formal classroom, but also of experiential learning contexts in more semi-formal and informal spaces in order to see how learning can be best given to students with the opportunities of both abstracted forms and embodied forms. And so we can see learning as a multi-level, multi-perspectival endeavor, and we can see it through a way in which we could cohere the biological layer all the way to the social cultural layer. And we can see how these would be windows of opportunity from early childhood to adult learning, and to stage learning scaffolds and mediating mechanisms along this lifespan. And we hope that this process enables the Science of Learning Center, and I'm proposing today or elaborating, would be able to provide us by data sources for learning upon different layers, and that we might be able to find the methodologies to understand how learning were to occur for these different kinds of learners and learners with different orientations. I wouldn't use the word learning styles because I think it's something that locks our perspective in, because I think our learners are very flexible, and that we would want to use the best designs to optimize their learning opportunities, inclusive of 21st century kinds of learning. And so, in a nutshell, SOLE has linkages not just to the observable behavioral approaches, but to the implicit knowledge. And I think that can be seen in terms of the CCE movement that we currently have, character and citizenship education. And Science of Learning techniques would be able to help us, hopefully, understand how values and implicit knowledge forms in our learners and how they align themselves to different community identities, okay, in disciplinary learning. And so with CCE as a place, a space, a platform through which we can also intersect with SOLE, we hope that we might be able to advance understandings in learning in these ways in which the rest of which are listed here, that can help NIE as a place, as a pedagogical institution for teachers to design learning environments, learning interactions, and learning spaces through the use of technologies, AI, and assessments for different kinds of learners, including those with special needs. Thank you very much.